test those stories. They run those tests, provide the evidence, and then capture that for audit purposes and things like that. Now, obviously, the thing to bear in mind is that for a reasonably large piece of software, this manual testing is very slow and very labor intensive, and obviously sometimes it can also be quite repetitive. So for example, when we kind of think we finished the software and we've kind of tested and closed all the stories, we then go into basically like a test release phase where we have to basically repeat a set of tests twice over the course of 3 or 4 weeks to basically just test and make sure that everything still works as expected, and things like regression testing and that kind of thing. But yeah, because of how long that manual testing takes, it's not really possible to run all of those tests, against each version of the software. And yeah, so we kind of have to pick and choose, when we want to do those. And so yeah, normally towards the end of the project. Then the other side of it is, we used to do some automated testing using a tool called like AutoIt or Securely, which is kind of like a desktop automation tool. Like they use it quite often in IT, and you can use it for like, if you're having to copy and paste data from a website into an Excel sheet, you can automate that using a tool like that. The issue was that it's not really designed for software testing. So you're kind of having to do all the reporting and things like that, and the tools that you've got for like matching, does this image look, or does what's on the screen look like it's supposed to, is all quite limited. And these scripts, it's not a full programming language, so you don't get the advantage of things like functions and libraries and all that kind of stuff that we're kind of used to as software developers. So we kind of asked ourselves the question of could we do better? What are other industries doing to test their their built software, other than things like the developer side, things like unit testing and that kind of thing. So I'm going to try and do some demos, but it's been a while since I've opened these up, but we'll have a look and and see what we can find. So this tool that I'm going to show you as a quick sort of starting demo is something called TestComplete. And this is kind of like an industry, a software industry standard tool for testing software. It's not free. You have to pay for a license for it. So, just if you kind of, get all excited, just to caveat that, but certainly with the amount of time that it saves in terms of like not having to do manual testing, I think it quite easily pays for itself quite quickly. So that's something to bear in mind. So the little application, sort of, I'm going to show you sort of a C# software example to begin with. So if I open up the application. Oh, you got to open, I think. So yeah, this is just like a little test application that ships with the program, and it's basically just a little like order manager. So I can I can create a new order, a screensaver, and I can enter my name in here, and then I see that my order appears in there. I'm sorry, it's not very big, but yeah, hopefully you kind of it's a very simple sort of Windows Forms application. That you can use. So let's say we want to test this and make sure that it works properly. So if I close that back down again. And if I open up this the project in TestComplete, I can then run this project, run these tests, and you can see it's basically like it's automating my desktop. So you can see it's just very quickly running through the software and performing a bunch of steps, and then at the very end we can see that we've got a nice green tick here that shows that that test has passed. So yeah, that's a very simple a simple test, and you can see that there's inside here, you've got kind of like different test types. So a keyword test. So this is kind of like the test stand equivalent. If you're familiar with test stand, this is kind of like the test stand equivalent of how you build up a test, which is where you kind of, this looks almost identical to test stand in that you're kind of dragging and dropping, steps into your kind of sequence, and getting it to enter in data and check that you get the result that you expect. So that's kind of one way of creating your tests. You can also record these. There's like a macro recording function that allows you to kind of just if you want to exercise your software in a certain way as part of your test, you can basically like you would in Excel, you can basically press the record button, you can do the thing that you want to do, and then kind of just add in your your pass fail steps in there. So that's that. And then the other side of it is that you can also write scripts. You can write your tests using common scripting languages. So there's an example here of a test using JavaScript, but it also supports Python as well. So we actually use the Python side of the scripting to write all of our tests in, just because I think we tend to find it easier to find people with Python experience than JavaScript experience. So yeah, that's a very, very quick rundown of TestComplete with C#. So yeah, just to kind of talk about it a little bit. Yeah, it's a suite for testing desktop, web, and mobile applications. You can create and build your tests using the macro recording, keyword tests, or the script tests, either using Python or JavaScript. It integrates quite nicely with Jenkins. So they have like the TestComplete, which is kind of like the IDE, which you use to develop your tests. And then there's basically like a test execute license, which you can put on a build server for just running your tests, headlessly. It's also got things like Jira integration, so it can kind of publish your test results, into Spark. Oh, sorry, not SparkFlow, because that's our internal name for Jira, into Jira. And then you've got things like, test reporting, so it can output JUnit test reports, HTML reports, and all that kind of fun stuff. Like I said, it is a paid tool, and there are sort of like add-ons and things. There's different packages you can buy. Like there's a desktop one, there's an app one, there's a a website one, and they've also got like an OCR add-on as well, which requires you to which can do character recognition and image matching and that kind of thing. Can any TestComplete license run via Jenkins? Yes, you don't need to have a test execute license, but you can't run your TestComplete license locally on your machine at the same time as also running it on the build server. So if you're trying to run the tests concurrently at the same time as developing them, then you'd need to buy a test execute license. I hope that answers the question. Okay, what about with LabVIEW? Wouldn't it be nice? And good luck with that. Was kind of my initial responses of, can we use this tool with LabVIEW? So by default, the way that it works is that it kind of hooks into the WinForms component, which is kind of like the rendering, engine that most Windows applications use. So for example, if I TestComplete, and if I you have this object browser built into TestComplete, which kind of helps you find the things that you're trying to test. So if I open up my application again, and I go to the object browser in here, and I find it in here, I can basically find my window, and I can find my orders view, and I can find, you can basically navigate, the structure of the GUI of this application to find the things that you're interested in. So, you can, navigate through all of this, and you've got all this nice thing that shows you all of your properties and what's inside it and all that kind of fun stuff. None of this you can do with LabVIEW. So because LabVIEW uses its own windowing / GUI rendering, pretty much the only thing that's kind of exposed to you, in TestComplete is that you have a main window. So you can see this, main.vi here, but you can't find out anything about what's inside it in terms of, what controls do you have on your front panel, what do you, yeah, um, yeah, what are their values, things like that. So this does kind of make things a bit harder for us, but it's not impossible. So there are some options. So for example, using the OCR, intelligent quality add-on, you can do sort of image-based testing and matching. So you can use the OCR component to find some text on the screen, and you can use the image matching to, check the enabled and disabled state of a button. Because it's also using you can use like Python, you can basically use ActiveX. So if you enable the VI server ActiveX interface, you can, read control data and things like that using the sort of the built-in LabVIEW ActiveX interface. But the amount of data that you can get from it is really quite limited. Like the ActiveX interface is kind of restrictive. So the other way that you can do it is a VI server test interface, and that's kind of the route that I'm going to sort of show you a little bit more about and kind of explain in a bit more detail. So I'll just caveat this. This is kind of a bit of an internal interface. So I'm going to show you some of the details and show you how it works. But I can't kind of share this code with the community as it's kind of been developed internally. But there is nothing special about it. So it's not really doing anything particularly fancy or clever. It's just interacting with VI server properties to kind of find the information about controls and then use a TCP socket to send the data back and forth. So that's really all that the VI server test interface is it's just exposing some more information from VI server about your application and your VIs and what's on them, basically, and then sends that via sort of simple commands over TCP/IP. So as a sort of like a little demo application, you've got my little state machine for my application running up here, and then alongside it I also run this little test interface listener. So I just drop that down into my main VI, and that kind of that will then sit there and listen for incoming sort of test information requests and service them. We've also made it sort of slightly class-based, so we kind of have like a core version of this, and then we can create different implementations for different products if we know we need to support specific controls or we want to add extra functionality to that test interface. Then we can kind of customize that on individual projects. And then we've basically written a Python module that kind of implements the sort of the JSON communication back and forth between the LabVIEW application and the LabVIEW application and the Python script. So the question was, would you use a conditional disable structure to include the test listener in the final product, or would you consider that a test risk, a security risk? Yes, absolutely. So this is a dummy application I'm going to show you today, but we have our build symbols that basically turn this off on on release builds of the product. We kind of have like a version that works on hardware, and we have like a desktop simulation version, and so we only enable the test interface on the simulation version because essentially you can find anything out about any of your controls, what's on the screen, using this. So do be aware that if you're opening up a port that there is a security implication there. But you can kind of see in the screenshot below a little bit of a peek inside. So we kind of have a JSON sort of command and data structure. So we kind of ask for the VI name and the control name. We use a little bit of scripting to find that control by its label, and we then basically inside this little sub VI we can basically take that control and then basically flatten the information that we're interested in about it to JSON and then send that back to the the TestComplete script. So to give you like a little flavor of this, so I've got a finite measurement, which is based on the built-in like LabVIEW example, and the only real modifications I've made to it is to add our little test interface at the bottom, and basically just an exit VI, which just tells this listener to shut down. So other than that, this is exactly the same as the the sort of the built-in measurement interface that we've got there. So if I open up my build folder, and if I run this application, so this is the built executable that's got the test interface in. I've just opened it up from this folder here. I can, as usual, settings. I can acquire some data. I can keep acquiring data. I can do some analysis on it. All this kind of funky stuff that you typically, I think this is quite a simple VI or quite a simple application, but it's kind of reasonably representative of like a bunch of things of that you might want to do in an application. So you've got like a settings screen, you've got a way of sort of loading data, and I think even this really trivial, quite a simple application, there's actually still quite a lot of stuff in here that if you were to actually fully manually test this application of, well, when I change these settings, does that actually change, do I get what I expect in the graph? If I acquire data, does this work? If I load data, does that work? If I clear, does it empty it? Do the buttons enable and disable, when I expect them to? I've done that again. If I copy the graph, do I have the right thing on the clipboard? Does my save and export work? And then, does the application, exit when I expect it to? So already in my head, I'm thinking there's probably like 10 different test cases or something in there. And then, for each of those, you'd probably want to test some, different, data sets and all that kind of stuff. If I load some data and do the analyze, do I get the value that I want? So if I was to if I was really concerned about quality and some critical customers were dependent on this everything on this working properly, and I had to make a change to it, I'd want to make sure that all of that functionality that's in this application kind of still works after I've made a change to it. So that's the application, and then we kind of have, as part of our sort of internal tools for this, we have kind of a test interface, sort of developer interface application, and this is really to help us, to help someone that's developing the scripts, be able to sort of find out what's going on in there. So this is quite a long list because it kind of gives you, tells you all of the VIs that are in your application. You can then filter, so I can find my main VI, and I can basically select items in here. So for example, if I select the graph, I can now see all of the data that is coming back out of that graph, over the TCP IP. So if I show you the sort of the JSON for that, you can see I've got all the the attributes that are in the graph. I've got the timestamps, all of my data, and so then easily in my sort of test script with the Python, I can kind of start passing this out, and after loading some data, basically check that I've got what I expect. I can also do something like select one of these buttons, and I can see that it's sort of the default data that we kind of return for everything is what's its name, what's its type, is it visible, what's its enabled state, and what's its value. So that's kind of like the typical kind of things that we're kind of interested in these tests. So if I clear this, it my buttons are now disabled, and if I go back to clear, I can see now that it's now shown as disabled and grayed out. So I can easily write a test now that checks that when I press the clear button, that this button gets grayed out. So yeah, that's a very quick overview of the sort of sort of the way that the protocol works, and sort of what we're trying to do under the hood. I've got like another demo in a bit, but just to kind of briefly introduce the behavior-driven development. this is kind of like a way to kind of structure your tests and yeah, can help you with sort of writing them. So typically, kind of when we started doing this, and especially with the sort of the older AutoIt scripts and the securely scripts, they were really long sequential, really long sequential scripts of like, obviously the device itself has got like a keypad with like up, down, left, right arrows. So the scripts were like press left, press left, press down, press down, press right, and you end up with like 1,000 lines of kind of repeated sort of behavior, and this can kind of make those scripts difficult to follow. It means that yeah, you end up with just like in a if you end up with LabVIEW spaghetti, you end up with a really like unmaintainable mess of code. Hopefully we want to try and be grouping grouping code together into functions and things like that. So yeah, I'd advise, if you are sort of starting to look at this, think about what are the sort of core common functions that you might want, create libraries for those, and then and if you end up with a big long script like that, it can be quite difficult for non-technical people to follow. So for example, for us as software developers, we're the real technical ones, but our like test engineers, they aren't necessarily so technical. They don't really understand how the code works, but they might want to look at the script and say, well, what is the script actually doing, because now it started failing after a code change and that kind of thing. So this idea of behavior-driven development is basically, as a team. So I'm talking about as a sort of we work in sort of cross-functional teams on a project. So we have, some software developers, we have some testers, we have a product owner, all these kind of roles that we have within the teams. As a team, you kind of get together, you decide what you're going to test, to what extent you're going to test it. So, how far are you going to go with your testing? And what you do is you create these sort of test scenarios in a simple language, and that language is called Gherkin. The basic structure of it is given X, when Y, then the result should be this. So I think James McNally's talked about this for like unit tests. It's a good way to structure unit tests as well, of like, given I've just acquired some data, when I press the analysis button, then I should get a value of 5, for example, for your test cases. So you can see an example of using TestComplete, what one of these sort of Gherkin file looks like. So this is kind of defining your test up here, and you'll notice that there's almost no code in there. It's all like human readable language that basically says, when you start my application and the login form is visible, when I enter, the username and password, then I see the message, welcome username. So there's no like sort of code there in that kind of definition of your test. And then what you do is, in TestComplete, you do something called create step definitions, and that basically creates each of these kind of phrases into a function, and you can then basically implement the sort of the code behind that function, using TestComplete. So it's quite a nice way to sort of structure your tests and things like that. So to show you an example of kind of bringing this all together, so if I go back to TestComplete, just make sure that my program is closed. Close that. TestComplete. If I open. So for this sort of demo, what I've done is created a few a few sort of Gherkin based tests. So for example, I've got one here to test the analyze function. So given the app is running and I have cleared any existing data, check the analysis mean calculation. So when I load the test data file, TDMS file, and I click the analyze button, then the mean value should be mean. So, and then you've got basically a human readable yes, you've got like a human readable, basically set of test cases. So, when I load the TDMS file, 0 DC TDMS, I expect my mean to be 0. When I load 5, I expect 5. And so here, like, I can basically add as many test cases as I want in here without having to change the actual sort of underlying script underneath it. So if I show you, yeah, what that looks like. Yeah, you can see here then when I've generated my test files, I'm now kind of filling in the filling in the code. So I think this one uses the OCR as an example. I think I've done a few examples without that as well. My second test I've done is one on the GUI itself. So you've got a couple of different test scenarios in here of, when you acquire data, these buttons should be enabled, and when I clear the data, these buttons are grayed out. So again, yeah, sort of a couple of examples in here, and this is one where I am actually using my test interface. So I've got a call here to get control data, from my main VI, and for each of my buttons, and it'll basically check that the state is the same. So yeah, so that's an example. Some examples here. So if I run this, hopefully it'll pass. It's been a while since I've actually run it. This is not looking very promising. And the curse of the demo has got me in that everything has failed. So hang on, why is that happened? I think I have an issue with it connecting to the test interface, but I can show you kind of a previous run on here. So for example, this was a run that I did a little while ago, and you can see that this kind of runs each of your tests, and that you get a nice little summary of each of your tests at the end. Okay, but yeah, but that proves that it has worked. It's just because I haven't run this for a while, so I won't try and debug it live. But yeah, so automating test execution. So yeah, we've got a Jenkins build set up for building our software. Follows the sort of the typical build, test, deploy. When we're running a build on a pull request, we also run VI analyzer as part of that as well. But that's kind of why it's grayed out here, because we're kind of building our sort of main development branch. We're also currently working on kind of incorporating those sort of TestComplete tests into Jenkins, so that once a week or after every build, we can kind of set those up to run automatically. And I kind of touched on the fact that there's a test execute is kind of like the test runner that you can use for sort of automated execution of the tests, whereas TestComplete is kind of like the IDE that you build your tests in. There's a Jenkins plugin for TestComplete, which kind of makes it easy to configure, like, how to run the tests, and supports things like sort of posting the test results to Jenkins and Jira. So kind of incorporating that into this into these results and things like that is all pretty straightforward. So to sort of summarize then, we're trying to leverage sort of industry standard tools for our sort of GUI and automated testing. It saves a lot of time, I think, running the automated tests for one of our products. And this is not a full set of automated tests. We still have more tests to write and more work to do there. But the tests take 4 or 5 hours to run on each build. and and that's doing it at sort of full automated automated speed versus doing it manually, where you've then got to somebody's got to take the evidence and they've got to put that into into Jira to close the stories and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, this is I think it really will save us time, and especially as you do each software release, you kind of reap the rewards of the effort that you've put into the into the tests each time that you have to kind of update the software, and be confident that updating the software hasn't caused something to break somewhere else. It'd be nice if like we could actually do this directly without having to kind of implement our own test interface. If LabVIEW moved to like a WinForms thing, I don't know if NXG was going to go that way, but that would have been a nice nice way to handle that. The OCR toolkit / add-on generally works quite well, but we have had some issues with sort of test robustness of a minor change where we've kind of moved something by a few pixels on the GUI kind of then causes a test to fail, which shouldn't, it's not really in the sort of the spirit of the test, and just means that you have to kind of spend more time on test maintenance. So I think for us we got the kind of the best results from this sort of VI server test interface. And then just the Gherkin / behavior driven development, I think, is like a nice way to sort of structure your tests and provide a nice framework for creating sort of human readable test cases and scripts. I'm hoping Chris doesn't mind me mentioning this, but we are recruiting for 2 LabVIEW contractors. So if you're interested, then please send me an email at sam.sharp@agilent.com. We're kind of looking to recruit a couple of sort of temporary contractors, so let me know, but that's all I'll say on that.
No problem, Sam. Plug away.
Thanks. Okay, any questions? Are there any actions being taken in the champions group to improve the testability of UIs? I have no idea. I was hoping that with NXG, that this maybe that would have solved this problem for us, that maybe they were using more traditional control types and things. Unfortunately, I think that obviously they're kind of sticking with classic LabVIEW now. I think this is a pretty fundamental to the core of LabVIEW and the way that its user interfaces work and things like that, that I very much doubt that this will happen, that they'll suddenly switch all LabVIEW controls and indicators over to sort of WinForms and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't count on it, but yeah, it would be nice, and kind of one of those ways where LabVIEW doesn't quite keep up with other languages where things like this are kind of pretty trivial, that we're kind of have our hands tied behind our backs a little bit on the LabVIEW side. But yeah, I don't know. Any other questions, or otherwise I'm happy to.
How long did all that take, Sam? Like from the point where you decided to do this to the point where you are now? Like how much effort is there in it, really?
It depends. I mean, I think it entirely depends on like so I think learning the tool and incorporating the tool, I think, was pretty straightforward. Like I'm not a Python like programmer by any stretch of the imagination, but like the Python knowledge is is like the barrier to entry is quite low, because you're kind of writing fairly sequential steps, basically, that it doesn't need to be too too difficult. I'd say it's really about the applications that you're testing and the complexity of the complexity of them, like how many test cases you want to write. I talked about we kind of have 3 software developers to 1 sort of manual software tester. but we also now have one automated tester on each project as well. So you kind of have three developers, one person writing automated tests and one person running the manual tests. So it is, in terms of the cost of writing the tests for a particular piece of software, that is quite a large investment that you have to make. But I think if it's the kind of a piece of software where you're continuously maintaining it and updating it over time, then I think that kind of pays for itself. I think it does pay for itself that you can make some quite significant changes to the back end of the software. Like you could refactor the entire thing and still be confident that it still works as expected if you're kind of covered by those those manual tests, which GUI testing and things like that are just really not really very suited to unit tests. We have all of our unit tests kind of cover back end stuff like database interaction and like the processing and that kind of thing. But yeah, there's certain things that you really can't, GUI testing you can't really do very easily. Yeah.
And like just to follow on before you jump in, I think there's a couple of other questions.
Yep.
If you were doing products in the way that you are, in that you, like you've said, you've got those benefits because you're continually developing something as a product, would you still invest in it based on what you know from what you've learned through doing it up to this point? Does that make sense?
Probably not. Like I think if you're in the kind of business of doing like a one-off piece of software, like if you're doing like bespoke bits of software for each test rig or each application, I'd say it probably isn't worth the investment. I think to get that investment, it either has to be it kind of has to be a piece of software that kind of has a long a longer lifetime. If you're just if you're doing a version 1.0 of a piece of software for a test rig, and you might do some bug fixes afterwards, but it's not really going to get like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 where you're adding new features and that kind of thing. Yeah, I think perhaps it maybe doesn't make sense to to invest all that. But I think one of the things I've learned is that the more testing you do is always the better. So like like you could make the exact same argument about unit tests of like, well, I'm only doing this piece of software once and we'll never need to change it again, so why bother writing unit tests if we know that it works? And that's, I think unit testing I think is one of those things that kind of changed my attitude towards that. And you may also be under kind of regulatory requirements of how you do your testing. So like if we're doing stuff for sort of pharmaceutical products and defense and that kind of thing, where we need to be able to show and can be audited on how we've tested our software. And so the automating some of our testing kind of feeds into that as well. So
yeah, nice one. I think Tom, Steve, and Jesper have put something in the chat there.
Tom, if we made a UI using .NET controls, would it make testing easier? Yeah, I think so. So I think with the .NET controls, I think you'll be able to find them in that object browser and kind of interact with them that way. And then Steve, so as I kind of mentioned, when I kind of talked about the VI server, unfortunately, this is a kind of proprietary thing that we've kind of developed in-house. So there aren't any plans to make this available. I would say though it's not particularly complex, but yeah, at the moment there aren't any plans to kind of publish that. I will ask the question internally to see if that's something that we could do, but yeah, I wouldn't wait for that.
All right, so any other questions before Sam jumps off? No, we're all good. Thanks very much, Sam. Really appreciate that. Really interesting presentation on a subject that's kind of definitely interesting to a lot of people, I think. So nice one.